You know that feeling when you want to like really understand something important, something that shaped how people think about a whole field. But, well, the idea of tackling a massive book feels like climbing a mountain.
Yeah, totally. Information overload is real.
Exactly. So that's why we're here. We're doing a deep dive into a truly foundational work, David J. Bosch's Transforming Mission.
Yeah.
We want to pull out the key insights, without making you feel like you've just earned a doctorate in theology.
Right. And this book, it came out in 91. It wasn't just another book on mission. Robert Schreider, who's a big name himself in missiology,
I know the name.
he called it a milestone. Put Bosch right up there with like Hendrik Kramer and Kenneth Scott Latourette, serious heavyweights.
Wow.
And some people even said Bosch was maybe the most complete missiologist of his generation, maybe even the century. That's a huge claim.
Absolutely huge. And it wasn't just academic chatter, was it? This thing took off.
Oh, definitely. It quickly became the go-to textbook for studying mission, used in universities, seminaries, all over the globe.
And they even made it easier to get into, right?
Sure.
With companion books.
Yeah, they put together classic texts in mission and world Christianity, which kind of shows you Bosch's sources, where he was coming from. And then there was a simpler reader's guide, too, for, lay audiences. So a real effort to make it accessible.
Which says a lot about its perceived importance.
And what's really remarkable is how relevant it still is. I mean, 20 years after it first came out, it was still being called one of the most important theology books of the late 20th century.
Christianity Today put it on their top 100 list for the century, didn't they?
They did. And the fact they're still printing new editions, doing new translations. I think a German one just came out last year.
Really? That recently?
Yeah, it just tells you something. They even added a new chapter later on just to track its ongoing impact. So our goal today really is to unpack why. Why did this book hit so hard, and why does it still matter?
Okay, sounds good. So let's start with the person, David J. Bosch. You mentioned his background was interesting.
Yeah, it really was. Born in South Africa, grew up on an Afrikaner farm. Then he heads off to Europe for his doctorate, New Testament studies under Oscar Cullmann.
Okay, Cullmann Salvation History. Right.
Yeah.
God working through time.
Exactly. That was a big piece. But then you also have Karl Barth's influence. Barth really hammered home that mission isn't just part of theology. It's like central to the whole thing. And then there's his friendship with John Howard Yoder. That brought in a strong Anabaptist stream of thought about the church, its distinctiveness, nonviolence.
Right. And that mix gets even more potent when you consider his context back in South Africa.
Absolutely. Here he is, an Afrikaner, but he starts questioning apartheid, questioning the theological arguments his own church was using to justify it.
That must have taken incredible courage.
No doubt. And it cost him. He got marginalized within the Dutch Reformed Church, but he didn't back down. He'd also been a missionary with the Xhosa people, learned Xhosa fluently, taught black pastors.
Because he wasn't just an ivory tower academic. He was deeply involved on the ground.
That's crucial. Theory and practice were always connected for Bosch. He was very active in the South African Missiological Society, SAMSES, and their journal, Missionalia, and he was always trying to build bridges.
Between who?
Between, say, the ecumenical movement and evangelical circles. He worried about what he called a diluted gospel on one side, maybe too focused on social action without the core message, and an emaciated gospel on the other, maybe too focused on individual salvation without the social implication.
Trying to hold things together.
Yeah. For him, a reconciled, unified Christian community wasn't just nice, it was essential for authentic mission.
Okay, so let's dive into the book's core ideas then. You mentioned he had a different view of the Bible and mission, not just a foundation.
Right. He saw the Bible as much more dynamic, not just a source book you dip into for mission strategies, but something that continuously forms the church's understanding of its mission.
How did he show that?
Well, one fascinating way was looking at the New Testament itself. He didn't just pull out mission verses. He looked at major sections, Matthew, Luke, Acts, Paul, and argued they each represent distinct mission theologies.
So different models of mission right there in the text.
Exactly. They weren't just recording history. They were theological reflections shaping how those early Christian communities saw their task, how they lived out their calling. The key insight: Mission in the New Testament wasn't monolithic. It was diverse from the get-go.
So the whole New Testament is kind of a missionary document, but with these different facets.
Precisely. And to bridge that gap between the ancient texts and the church today, he developed this idea of a critical hermeneutics.
Okay, hermeneutics interpretation. Critical means.
It means engaging seriously with the historical context, the different voices within the text, not just taking it at face value or proof texting. And for Bosch, the absolute center, the anchor for all interpretation, was the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Makes sense.
And he pointed out that things like translation, contextualization, adapting the message, that wasn't something we invented. It was happening right there within the New Testament.
Interesting. Were there criticisms of this approach?
Yeah, fair criticisms. Some scholars noted he perhaps didn't give as much attention to the Old Testament's role in shaping mission, or specifically to the Johannine literature, the Gospel of John and his letters.
Okay.
But even with those points, his work was massively influential. It really laid the groundwork for what became known as missional hermeneutics, reading the Bible through a missional lens.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned Karl Barth's influence, the idea of mission being central to theology. Bosch took that even further, didn't he?
He really did. He basically argued that mission theology isn't just a branch of theology, it's the purpose, the mission of theology itself.
So theology's job is mission.
In a fundamental sense, yes. The idea is that theology kind of loses its raison d'être, its reason for being, if it's not critically accompanying the church in its mission in the world. For Bosch, the goal was this missional penetration of all of theology.
Meaning it shouldn't just be a separate department, like foreign affairs.
Exactly. It needs to infuse everything, how we think about God, the church, salvation, everything. He saw theology as this public conversation involving academics, the church, and wider society. He used the Greek terms theoria, thinking, poiesis, doing or making, and praxis, action informed by reflection.
And he used Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts to look at history.
Yeah, influenced by Hans Kung's work on church history, he used paradigm shifts to trace how the church's understanding of mission has changed over the centuries.
So different eras had fundamentally different ways of thinking about mission.
Right. But importantly, he didn't see these as just replacing each other. It was more like building up this complex picture. He called it a pluriverse of missiology in a universe of mission. Lots of valid perspectives within the one overarching mission of God. Okay.
Now, his focus was primarily on Western Christendom's history, that's true. But the insights about how these shifts happen, how context shapes theology, are super relevant for the global church today. And there's this growing sense, as one historian said, that maybe all church history must be read as mission history.
Because the church's story is fundamentally about its engagement with the world, its expansion, its mission.
Exactly.
This leads us into what Bosch called the emerging ecumenical missionary paradigm. That sounds like a key part of the book.
Oh, absolutely. Part 3 of Transforming Mission. This is where he really tackles the big doctrinal challenges for mission theology today.
And what's the foundational idea there?
It comes back to that relationship between mission and church. He basically flips the script. Traditionally, we think the church does mission. Bosch, following others, but really crystallizing it, argued that mission comes first, God's mission. And that mission, the Missio Dei, actually creates the church.
Wow, okay, so the church exists because of mission. Yes. The church is the church of Jesus Christ, only insofar as it understands itself as participating in God's mission. It's not an optional extra. It's fundamental to its being. You see this echoed in Vatican II's famous statement, "The Pilgrim Church is missionary by its very nature."
And this wasn't just abstract theology for him, he said. It connects to the local church.
Very much so. He stressed that the primary place we should be thinking about mission theologically is the local community, the church on the ground, everywhere. As he put it, the church in mission is primarily the local church everywhere.
Right, where faith is lived out day to day.
And he developed this concept of the church as the alternative community. You can really see the Anabaptist influence here from Yoder.
What does that mean, alternative community?
It means the church needs to embody a different way of living, distinct from the surrounding culture. There's a necessary tension, not hostility necessarily, but a difference that allows it to be a witness, to speak prophetically. But it's not about withdrawing into a holy huddle.
So distinct but engaged.
Exactly. It's about the church renewing itself for the sake of the world.
Now, you mentioned this idea faced some criticism.
It did. Some felt that focusing so heavily on the church's distinctiveness, its alternative nature, might risk downplaying its direct responsibility for social justice, for tackling poverty, for engaging prophetically within the structures of society.
Like it could become too inwardly focused.
Potentially, yeah. And there were questions about whether it adequately engaged with the specific challenges and theological perspectives coming from the majority world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, concerns about prioritizing the poor, for instance.
How did Bosch respond to that kind of thinking? Did he advocate for, say, revolution?
No, he rejected revolutionary overthrow. For Bosch, genuine social renewal wasn't primarily political in that sense. It was fundamentally a spiritual and ecclesial challenge. It had to be rooted in a truly Christian understanding of humanity that doesn't prioritize any single group.
So transformation comes from within the church's transformed life.
That's the idea. He pictured the church as an experimental garden, a place where the values of God's coming kingdom, unity, fellowship, justice, are already being practiced, being lived out, grounded always in Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection.
And this changed how he saw salvation too, not just saving souls for heaven.
Right. He moved away from a purely redemptive history model that might focus only on the afterlife. He pushed for a more comprehensive understanding of salvation's soteriology, recognizing the present reality of God's reign, the eschaton breaking in now, and that makes justice, reconciliation, care for creation. These become integral parts of mission, not optional extras.
What about evangelism then? Sharing the gospel.
Still absolutely essential for Bosch. But he saw it as one vital element within the broader scope of mission. It's about inviting people, alerting people to the universal reign of God, as he put it, but not equating evangelism with the whole of mission. He talked about doing this with bold humility or humble boldness.
Confidence in the message, but respect for the person. Given Bosch's African roots, let's talk about Africa and other contexts. You mentioned some critique that the book maybe didn't engage enough with indigenous theologies there.
Yeah, that's a fair point some critics raised about transforming mission itself. Less explicit focus on, say, deep contextualization debates or indigenous spiritualities or creation theology as it was developing in Africa, or, importantly, the massive Pentecostal movement sweeping the continent.
But you also said he did engage with African theologians elsewhere.
Yes, there's evidence of that, particularly in his writings in Afrikaans, which obviously weren't as widely read internationally. So the engagement was happening maybe just not as front and center in this particular book.
Okay. And his focus in the book remained
on developing a mission theology geared towards changing reality, challenging injustice, rather than just adapting to or accepting existing situations. He was also somewhat cautious about identifying specific historical events too readily as direct acts of God.
What about contextualization? How did he see the gospel relating to culture?
He leaned towards what's sometimes called a synthetic model. For Bosch, the core universal gospel message always had priority. Culture and context were crucial servants, vital for expressing and understanding that gospel, but they couldn't override it. He aimed for a creative tension.
Keeping gospel and context in dialogue, but the gospel has the final word.
Essentially, yes. It's undeniable that Transforming Mission is, a Western book shaped by his Dutch Reformed background. But its influence far beyond the West is equally undeniable. It resonated deeply in many non-Western contexts.
Let's shift focus a bit to the West itself. Bosch wrote as the idea of Christendom that cozy relationship between church and Western culture was clearly ending.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Karl Barth had been flagging this for a while. The West itself was becoming a mission field. Bosch recognized this profoundly. Western cultures were now deeply missionary situations.
The church couldn't take its position for granted anymore.
Not at all. There was this growing awareness, really accelerating, that the church had a primary missionary responsibility within its own Western context. This fueled the rise of what's called missional ecclesiology.
Okay, ecclesiology, study of the church. Missional meaning.
Meaning focused on the church's inherent missionary nature, especially in the West. This was driven partly by, declining church attendance, but also by a deeper theological reflection on the church's changing relationship with modern pluralistic societies.
And Bosch's big argument that mission is fundamental. Yeah. Really fed into this, right?
Massively. Transforming mission became a cornerstone text for this whole conversation. People started talking about needing ecclesiologies at the margin. How does the church live when it's not dominant? And this crucial shift from church-shaped mission
Where the church decides its mission programs.
to mission-shaped church, where God's mission actually shapes the church's identity, its structures, its very being.
That's a radical shift.
It is. The idea of the missional church wasn't just a new program, it was presented as a paradigm shift. Mission moves from being part of the church's well-being, its benese, to being its fundamental essence, its essay.
And figures like Leslie Newbegin were important here too.
Hugely important, especially through initiatives like the Gospel and Our Culture Network. Newbegin came back from years as a missionary in India and essentially asked, what would a Western church look like if it actually understood its own culture as a mission field? The core question became, what if the church was defined by its missional calling?
And Bosch provided the theological engine for this, with Missio Dei.
Exactly. His articulation of Missio Dei rooted in the Trinity, God the Father sending the Son, Father and Son sending the Spirit, and that sending extending to the church provided the deep theological grounding for so much of the missional church discussion. It forced a hard look at inherited structures from the Christendom era. Were they actually helping or hindering the church's mission now?
So the missional church sees itself primarily as sent.
Yes. It's an instrument, a witness to the gospel, defined as God sent people. The emphasis is less on just strategy and more on biblical and theological foundations. It's about participating in God's work of redeeming and restoring the world.
Bridging that gap between Sunday morning and Monday morning, between outreach and congregational life.
Trying to, yes.
Yeah.
And pushing back against Western individualism, stressing the corporate identity of the church as the body of Christ sent together. There's this rhythm he talked about, like breathing.
Inhaling and exhaling.
Sort of.
Okay.
Discipleship being formed together, inhaling, and apostolate being sent out in witness, exhaling. A missional community needs both that inward gathering and that outward movement, moving beyond an abstract faith to a lived incarnational faith.
Okay. What else defines this missional church understanding?
A huge focus is the reign of God, Jesus' central message, right?
The kingdom of God is near.
Exactly. So the missional church understands itself as representing that reign. It's meant to be a sign, a foretaste, an instrument of God's new world breaking into the present. It points beyond itself to God's future.
This connects back to Latour's kingdom test you mentioned, judging Christianity's impact by its fruits.
Precisely. And again, you see the influence of Anabaptist thought, Yoder emphasizing radical discipleship. What does it mean to actually follow Jesus in all of life? It brings a real concern for the church's public witness, its integrity.
Challenging things like consumerism.
Yeah, challenging the cultural idols. The idea is a kind of conversion of the church itself, turning back to its core missional kingdom calling, seeing itself as a contrast society.
Living differently.
Yes, living out, as the reformers might say, nonconformity to the world and conformity to Christ. And this is important not just withdrawing, also being a public companion committed to the good of the whole society. It's that tension again.
The threefold call to follow, witness, and serve.
That sums it up well.
So, wrapping up the impact, how did transforming mission change the study of mission itself?
Well, it really cemented missiology as this thoroughly integrative discipline. It showed you couldn't just do mission studies over here and Bible, history, theology over there. It pulls everything together.
Biblical studies, history, doctrine, social sciences, theology of religions.
All of it. Bosch's book is the prime example of that integration. It just broadened and deepened the understanding across the board of how vital mission is for all Christian theology. It captured a moment of huge global shifts and gave people a framework to understand them.
And that theme you mentioned, creative tension, seems key to his whole approach.
It really is. It runs all through the book, reflecting the complexity of mission, the diverse contexts, the need to hold different truths together dialectically. He was always trying to overcome false dichotomies, evangelism or social action, local or global, church or world.
Trying to show the fullness of the gospel.
Yes. He aimed for comprehensiveness. You see it in his analysis of the elements of an emerging ecumenical missionary paradigm, trying to synthesize different streams.
Which connects to his own ecumenical involvement.
Yeah, deeply. He was involved in so many different ecumenical bodies. Overcoming that evangelical ecumenical split was a major concern for him. He believed Christian unity was essential for effective witness.
And the book was received that way. ecumenically.
Very much so. It really helped bring different perspectives together within missiology, and others have built on it, like Stephen Bevan's and Roger Schroeder's Constance in Context, which expands Bosch's framework, bringing in more Catholic sources, for example.
So Bosch himself modeled this integration.
Absolutely. His life, his writing, his teaching, his activism, it was all of a piece.
Yeah.
A real model of integrity, what some call prophetic integrity, or cruciform praxis action shaped by the cross. And Transforming Mission reflects that. It's a text that, well, continues to transform the subject and its students. You still see courses taught on it today.
Amazing longevity. Okay, so as we bring this deep dive to a close, it's pretty clear David J. Bosch's Transforming Mission wasn't just another book. Its impact has been profound and really lasting.
Definitely. It's far more than just a historical text. It continues to shape the conversation, challenge assumptions about mission, even now.
And maybe the biggest takeaway, the most transformative idea, is that mission isn't just a thing the church does. It's not peripheral.
Right. It's absolutely central. Central to the church's identity, its purpose, central even to how we should do theology. It demands this comprehensive, integrated approach, constantly holding those creative tensions.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. How might Bosch's idea of creative tension holding seemingly opposing truths together and that concept of the church as an alternative community, how might those ideas challenge or maybe reframe your own understanding of your faith and its place in the world today?
Yeah, what does it really mean for the church, for us as Christians, to see ourselves primarily as sent people rather than just people who occasionally send others or support missions from afar?
Lots to think about there. Definitely worth digging deeper into Bosch's work if this has sparked your interest.